In the heart of Brookton, West Virginia, where cold dust settles on everything, and hope seems as scarce as steady work. An 8-year-old boy named Kevin Taylor is about to turn a moment of cruel mockery into something that will shock an entire community. When 17-year-old Brett Anderson, son of the town's most powerful factory owner, decides to humiliate the poor mechanic's kid by challenging him to fix an impossibly complex industrial machine just for fun, nobody expects what happens next. What Brett, intended as the ultimate joke, will expose not only his own cruelty, but reveal a young mind so extraordinary that it will attract attention from engineering professors, transform his family's struggling circumstances, and teach everyone present that genius doesn't announce itself with fancy clothes or expensive schools. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you, the morning sun struggled through the perpetual haze that hung over Brookton, like a gray blanket casting long shadows across Main Street, where Taylor Auto Repair sat wedged between Henderson's Hardware and what used to be Murphy's 5 and Dime. The building looked tired, its red brick facade weathered by decades of West Virginia winters and summers that seemed to grow hotter. Each year paint peeled from the wooden sign that Dave Taylor had handletted himself when he first took over the shop from old Mr. Kowalski. 5 years ago, inside the cramped garage, the familiar symphony of mechanical work filled the air. Wrenches clinked against metal air compressors, wheezed to life, and somewhere in the back a radio played classic rock at just the right volume to mask the sound of frustration when something didn't go according to plan. The smell of motor oil, gasoline, and honest sweat had soaked into every surface, creating an atmosphere that spoke of hard work and harder times. Dave Taylor emerged from beneath the hood of a 1998 Ford pickup, his calloused hands black with grease, a streak of oil across his forehead, where he'd wiped sweat with the back of his wrist. At 35, he looked older than his years, the kind of aging that comes from worry rather than time. His shoulders carried the weight of a man who knew that every repair job might be the difference between making rent and having another difficult conversation with his landlord. "Kevin, hand me that. 3 to 4 in socket," he called out. Not looking up from the engine bay, 8-year-old Kevin Taylor appeared from behind a stack of tires, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in this world of machinery and possibility. He was small for his age, with dark hair that never seemed to stay combed and eyes that missed nothing. His clothes were clean but well worn, the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of a family that took care of what they had, because replacing it wasn't an option. This one, Dad Kevin held up the socket already, knowing it was correct before his father confirmed it with a nod. The boy had been practically raised in this garage, spending afternoons here, since he was old enough to sit quietly and watch what had started as necessity when Linda worked her evening shift at the diner had become something else entirely. Kevin didn't just observe the work, he absorbed it, understanding not just what his father did but why he did it, how each component related to the whole, how problems could be solved through patience and logic. "You see how the alternator connects to the battery?" Dave asked, pointing with his wrench. "Everything in here has to work together. One part fails, it affects everything else." Kevin nodded, studying the engine with the intensity of someone much older, like when Mrs. Henderson's car was making that clicking noise and you knew it was the starter even before you looked. "That's right. You listen to what the machine is telling you." Dave smiled, one of the genuine ones that reached his eyes and reminded Kevin that despite the long hours and constant worry, his father still found joy in this work. "Machines don't lie. Son, they tell you exactly what's wrong, if you know how to listen." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of expensive tires on gravel through the open garage door. A black BMW SUV pulled into the small parking area, looking as out of place as a diamond ring in a toolbox. The vehicle was pristine, freshly washed and detailed, the kind of automotive perfection that spoke of money and the leisure time to maintain appearances. Dave straightened up instinctively, wiping his hands on his coveralls in Brookton. There were only a few families who drove cars like that, and none of them typically brought their business to Taylor Auto Repair. They had their vehicles serviced at the dealership 30 mi away in Charleston, preferring the sterile environment of corporate service departments to the honest grit of an independent shop. The driver's door opened and Brett Anderson stepped out with the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. At 17, he was tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of athletic build that came from private tennis, lessons, and a gym membership his parents paid for without thinking his clothes were expensive, but carefully casual designer jeans and a polo shirt that probably cost more than Dave made in a week. Behind Brett emerged two other teenagers, Jake Morrison and Brad Sterling, both carrying themselves with the easy confidence of young men who had never faced genuine hardship. They looked around the garage with barely concealed disdain, taking in the cluttered workspace, the aging equipment, and the general atmosphere of people who worked with their hands to survive. Mr. Taylor, Brett said, his voice carrying the kind of polite condescension that was somehow worse than outright rudeness. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." Dave set down his wrench, already feeling the familiar tension that came whenever the Anderson family paid attention to his world. Brett's mother, Diane Anderson, owned the largest manufacturing plant in the county, a facility that employed nearly half the town, but had never once brought their fleet maintenance business to local shops. The Andersons lived in a different Brookton than the one where Dave raised his family, a version where problems were solved with money rather than ingenuity. "What can I do for you, Brett?" Dave asked, his voice neutral, but wary. Brett's attention shifted to Kevin, who had moved to stand beside his father, small but unafraid. The teenager's smile widened, taking on an edge that made Dave's protective instincts flare to life. He had seen that expression before, usually right before someone tried to make his family the target of their entertainment. "Actually, Mr. Taylor, we were wondering if we could borrow your son for a few minutes." Brett said, his tone light and conversational. "See, we've got this little problem at the plant and someone suggested that maybe the local mechanics kid might know something about fixing things." Jake and Brad snickered behind him, the kind of barely suppressed laughter that announced the presence of a joke that hadn't been shared with everyone present. Dave felt his jaw tighten, recognizing the setup, even if he couldn't yet see all the angles. "Kevin's just 8 years old," Dave said carefully. "I'm not sure what kind of help he could be with anything at the plant." "Oh, it's nothing too complicated," Brett continued, his smile never wavering. "Just a machine that's been giving our engineers some trouble. Thought maybe fresh eyes might see something. They missed, you know how kids are always finding solutions adults overlook." The words were right, even supportive. But everything about Brett's manner suggested the opposite. Kevin looked up at his father, reading the tension in Dave's posture, understanding, without being told, that this situation required careful navigation. "What kind of machine?" Kevin asked, his voice clear and direct. Brett's eyebrows rose slightly, as if surprised that the boy had spoken. Smart kid asking the right questions. "It's a hydraulic press system. Pretty sophisticated stuff, been down for 3 days now, costing us thousands of dollars every hour it's not running." Dave's protective instincts shifted into high gear. A hydraulic press was serious industrial equipment, the kind of machinery that could seriously injure or kill an adult, let alone a child. The idea of his 8-year-old son anywhere near such equipment was unthinkable. "Absolutely not," Dave said firmly. "That's not appropriate for Kevin to be around." "Oh, come on, Mr. Taylor," Brett said, his tone taking on a wheedling quality. "We're not asking him to actually work on it. Just take a look, maybe share some observations. It would be perfectly safe, I promise." Brad Sterling stepped forward, pulling out his phone with a casual gesture that somehow felt threatening. "Besides, it would be kinda cool to get this on video. You know, local kid helped solve big industrial problem. Might even go viral." The mention of video made Dave's stomach drop. He had seen enough of what passed for entertainment on social media to know that not all viral videos were created with kind intentions. The image of his son being humiliated for the amusement of strangers was enough to make him take a step forward, placing himself more directly between Brett and Kevin. "I said no," Dave repeated, his voice carrying a finality that broke no argument. Brett's smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. When it returned, it carried a different quality, less friendly and more calculating. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Taylor," Brett said softly, "because my mother was just mentioning yesterday how much she appreciates local businesses that are willing to go the extra mile for the community. You know how much the plant means to this town, how many jobs depend on keeping things running smoothly." The threat was subtle but unmistakable in a town like Brookton, where economic opportunities were scarce, and the Anderson family wielded considerable influence. Even the suggestion of their displeasure could have serious consequences. Dave felt the familiar weight of financial pressure, the constant calculation of how far he could push back, before it cost his family more than they could afford. Kevin stepped forward, his small hand finding his father's arm. "It's okay,
Dad,
he said quietly. "I'd like to see what they're talking about." Dave looked down at his son, seeing something in the boy's eyes that he couldn't quite identify. Kevin wasn't afraid, despite understanding the tension in the room. If anything, he seemed curious, the same expression he wore when confronting a particularly interesting mechanical problem. Dave started, but his son interrupted gently. "I know you're worried about the machine being dangerous," Kevin said, his voice carrying a maturity that sometimes surprised even his father. "But I also know you taught me to always be careful around equipment. I don't understand." "I won't touch anything without asking." The simple trust in his son's voice cut through Dave's protective instincts. Kevin had never given him reason to doubt his judgment or his ability to follow safety rules. The boy had been around dangerous equipment his entire life, and had never once acted recklessly or impulsively. Brett sensed the shift in Dave's resolve, and pressed his advantage. "Like I said, Mr. Taylor, perfectly safe. Just a quick look, and then we'll bring him right back. Shouldn't take more than an hour." Dave looked at his son one more time, seeing the quiet confidence that had always set Kevin apart from other children his age. Finally, against every parental instinct screaming in his head, he nodded slowly. "1 hour, he said firmly, "and I want your word that he stays away from any moving parts." "Absolutely," Brett agreed quickly, his smile returning to full brightness. "Just a quick consultation." Nothing more. As Kevin walked toward the BMW, Dave felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the mountaineer. He watched his son climb into the expensive vehicle surrounded by teenagers, whose intentions he didn't trust, heading toward a situation he couldn't control. What Dave didn't know was that Brett Anderson had spent weeks planning this moment, carefully orchestrating what he believed would be the perfect humiliation of the town's most vulnerable family. What Brett didn't know was that he was about to discover just how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone based solely on their age and circumstances. The BMW pulled away from Taylor Auto Repair, carrying an 8-year-old boy, toward a confrontation that would change everything for everyone involved. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The Anderson manufacturing plant sprawled across 15 acres on the outskirts of Brookton, its red brick buildings and smoking stacks, a testament to industrial prosperity in a region that had seen too little of it in recent decades. As Brett's BMW wound through the employee parking lot, Kevin pressed his face to the window, taking in the organized chaos of shift change workers in hard hats and safety vests emerged from the main building, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion that came from 8 hours of repetitive, demanding labor. "Impressive, isn't it?" Brett said, glancing at Kevin in the rearview mirror. "My mother employs 437 people here. That's almost half the families in Brookton." Kevin nodded politely but didn't respond. He had learned early that sometimes adults said things that weren't really meant to start conversations, but rather to establish their importance. The numbers Brett quoted meant jobs for people like Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Patterson, steady paychecks that kept families fed and housed. But they also meant power, the kind that could make or break small businesses, like his father's shop. Jake Morrison turned in the passenger seat, his phone already recording. "So, Kevin, you ever been inside a real factory before? This isn't like your dad's little garage, no sir." Kevin replied simply, missing or choosing to ignore the dismissive tone. "But I've read about manufacturing processes in some of my books." Brad Sterling laughed from beside Kevin's books. "What kind of 8-year-old reads about factories? The library has lots of interesting books," Kevin said matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Cooper in the children's section helps me find ones about how things work. Last month I read about assembly lines and quality control systems." Brett's eyes found Kevin's in the mirror, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. This wasn't quite the response he had expected. The plan required Kevin to be out of his depth, overwhelmed by the complexity of real industrial equipment. A kid who read about manufacturing processes in his spare time might prove more challenging to humiliate than anticipated. The BMW pulled up to the main entrance, where a security guard waved them through without question. Being Brett Anderson clearly came with privileges that extended beyond financial comfort. They walked through hallways lined with framed photographs showing the plant's history from its founding in 1962 to various expansion projects and safety awards. Kevin studied each image with the same focused attention he brought to everything, noting the evolution of the machinery and work practices over the decades. The hydraulic press is in Building C. Brett explained as they walked. It's our newest acquisition, state-of-the-art German engineering costs. My mother, too. $3 million. What does it manufacture? Kevin asked. Heavy-duty suspension components for commercial trucks. Jake answered, clearly proud of his knowledge. Each piece has to meet exact specifications or the whole shipment gets rejected. They pass through a series of doors, each requiring Brett to swipe an access card. The sound of machinery grew louder. As they approached their destination, the rhythmic pounding and hissing of industrial equipment operating at full capacity, Kevin could identify several different types of machines by sound alone. His ear, trained by years of listening to his father, diagnosed problems through audio cues building. She opened into a vast space filled with machinery that dwarfed anything Kevin had seen before. Overhead cranes moved steel beams with mechanical precision, while workers in safety gear operated equipment that looked like mechanical dinosaurs. The air smelled of hot metal cutting fluid and the particular ozone scent that came from high-voltage electrical systems there. She is, Brett announced with theatrical grandeur, pointing toward the far end of the building. The hydraulic press dominated its section of the factory floor like a sleeping giant, standing nearly 20 BF tall and stretching 40 F in length. It was an impressive monument to German engineering precision. Multiple hydraulic cylinders, each thicker than Kevin's entire body, were arranged in a complex configuration that spoke of tremendous forces held in careful check control panels, bristled with switches, gauges, and warning lights, while thick steel safety barriers surrounded the work area. Currently, those warning lights were flashing red, and the machine sat silent and motionless. Been down for 3 days. Brett continued, his voice taking on the rehearsed quality of someone delivering practiced lines. Our engineers are stumped. The hydraulic pressure builds correctly, all the safety systems check out, but when we try to engage the press cycle, nothing happens. Kevin approached the safety barrier, his hands clasped behind his back in the careful posture his father had taught him around dangerous equipment. Even silent, the machine commanded respect. The hydraulic lines were as thick as his arm, designed to handle pressures that could crush a car without effort. Safety PL placards in multiple languages warned of pinch points, high-pressure systems, and the need for proper training before operation. Has anyone checked the sequence timing? Kevin asked, his young voice barely audible over the ambient factory noise. Frank Sullivan, the factory foreman, looked up from a clipboard he'd been studying at 48. Frank had worked in manufacturing his entire adult life, starting as a floor operator. And working his way up through decades of steady competence, he wore the slightly surprised expression of someone who hadn't expected an 8-year-old to ask a relevant technical question. The timing relays were the first thing we tested, Frank said, walking over to join the group, all within normal parameters. Kevin nodded thoughtfully, continuing his visual inspection of the massive machine. What about the pressure accumulator? Sometimes when hydraulic systems lose prime, the problem isn't in the main system but in the backup pressure storage. Frank's eyebrows rose slightly. Brett's smile faltered as he realized the conversation was taking a turn. He hadn't anticipated this was supposed to be simple. Bring the kid in, let him stare helplessly at equipment far beyond his comprehension, and capture his confusion on video and create a viral moment of embarrassment that would remind everyone in Brookton of their proper place in the social hierarchy. We've checked the accumulator pressure, Frank said slowly, reading normal on all gauges. But have you checked the accumulator isolation valve? Kevin asked, pointing toward a section of the hydraulic system. If that valve is stuck partially closed, the gauges would show normal pressure, but the system wouldn't have enough flow rate for full operation. The foreman set down his clipboard and walked to a different control panel, one that Brett clearly hadn't expected him to access. Frank pressed a series of buttons and numbers began. scrolling across a digital display. After a moment he frowned and pressed more buttons, calling up different readings. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank muttered. "Isolation valve is showing 87% open, should be 100%. Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his phone still recording, but the expression on his face suggesting this wasn't going according to plan. "Maybe it's just a sensor malfunction," he said hopefully. "Easy way to check." Kevin said if you manually cycle the valve from the maintenance panel, you should hear the difference in hydraulic flow sound. Frank looked at Brett, clearly seeking permission to follow the boy's suggestion. The teenager nodded curtly, his jaw tight with frustration. This was supposed to be entertainment, not an actual troubleshooting session. The foreman accessed another control panel and initiated a manual valve cycle immediately. The sound of hydraulic flow changed, becoming deeper and more consistent. Several gauges that had been showing normal readings shifted to higher levels. Isolation valve was definitely the problem. Frank confirmed, genuine admiration creeping into his voice. "How did you know to look there?" Kevin shrugged with the casual confidence of someone stating an obvious fact in complex hydraulic systems. When you have pressure but no flow, it's usually a valve issue. The accumulator isolation valve is often overlooked because it's not part of the main operation cycle. Brett's face had shifted from theatrical friendliness to something harder. "Lucky guess," he said dismissively. "Let's test the theory," Frank suggested, moving to the main control station. "If the kid's right, this should solve our problem." The foreman initiated a test cycle and the massive hydraulic press came to life with a sound like controlled thunder. Hydraulic cylinders extended and retracted with mechanical precision, pressing a test piece of steel with the measured force of industrial engineering. Warning lights shifted from red to amber to green as the machine completed its cycle successfully. "Unbelievable," Frank said, shaking his head. 3 days of downtime and an 8-year-old spots the problem in 5 minutes. Workers from other sections of the building had begun to gather, drawn by the resumption of the press operation and the unusual sight of a child in the production area. Word traveled quickly in a factory environment, and within minutes a small crowd had formed around the hydraulic press station. "Who's the kid?" asked Jennifer Adams, the floor supervisor, arriving with several other workers in tow. "This is Kevin Taylor," Frank explained, "Dave Taylor's son from the auto shop on Main Street. Kid just diagnosed our hydraulic problem." The gathering crowd included several people Kevin recognized from his father's shop. Tony Marcelli, who brought his pickup truck in for regular maintenance, gave Kevin a friendly wave. Linda Cooper, who had her transmission rebuilt by Dave last year, looked impressed. These were people who understood the value of mechanical knowledge and weren't easily impressed by superficial credentials. "How'd you learn about hydraulic systems?" Tony asked. "That's pretty advanced stuff for someone your age. My dad teaches me about different types of machinery." Kevin explained hydraulics work the same whether they're in a car's brake system or a big factory press. The principles don't change, just the scale. Brett Anderson watched this interaction with growing frustration. His carefully planned humiliation was transforming into a celebration of exactly the kind of blue-collar competence he had intended to mock worse. It was happening in front of an audience of his mother's employees, people who would undoubtedly spread the story throughout Brookton before the day was over. "It's not that complicated," Brett said loudly, trying to regain control of the situation. Any mechanic could have figured that out. Eventually, the comment hung in the air with the particular awkwardness that came from someone trying too hard to diminish another person's achievement. Frank Sullivan looked at Brett with barely concealed irritation. As someone who had spent 3 days troubleshooting the problem without success, he didn't appreciate having the solution dismissed as simple. "Actually, Mr. Anderson," Frank said, "with careful formality, our maintenance team includes 2 certified hydraulic technicians and an industrial engineer. None of us thought to check that particular valve configuration." Kevin, oblivious to the growing tension, continued studying the hydraulic press with the focused interest of someone genuinely fascinated by complex machinery. "The safety systems are really well designed," he commented to Frank. "Multiple redundant pressure monitoring and emergency shutoffs. German engineering is supposed to be really good for that kind of reliability you're right about." That Frank agreed. This system has 17 different safety interlocks. Takes serious training just to understand the startup sequence. Brad Sterling, who had been quietly filming the entire interaction, finally spoke up. So what happens now? Do we just pretend an 8-year-old solved a problem that stumped actual engineers? The question carried an edge of resentment that made several workers bristle. These were people who understood. That knowledge came from experience and observation, not necessarily from formal education or social status. They had seen Kevin demonstrate genuine understanding, and Brad's dismissive tone suggested a kind of privilege-based arrogance that didn't sit well with working people. "What happens now," said a new voice from the edge of the crowd, "is that we acknowledge good troubleshooting when we see it, regardless of where it comes from." Everyone turned to see Diane Anderson approaching her heels, clicking authoritatively on the concrete floor at 45. Brett's mother commanded attention, through sheer force of competence and authority. She wore a tailored business suit that managed to look both professional and practical, the clothing of someone who understood that running a manufacturing operation required real substance behind the polished appearance. Brett's face went pale. His mother's presence was the last thing he had expected or wanted. Diane Anderson had built her business empire through careful attention to competence and results, and she had little patience for the kind of social games her son sometimes played. "Mrs. Anderson," Frank began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I heard from security that my son brought a guest to observe our hydraulic press repair," Diane said, her tone neutral, but carrying undertones that suggested Brett would be having a very uncomfortable conversation later. "I wanted to meet the young man who helped solve our production problem." She approached Kevin with the same direct manner she brought to business meetings, extending her hand for a handshake that the boy accepted with appropriate seriousness. "You must be Kevin Taylor," she said. "Frank tells me you identified our valve issue very quickly." "Yes, ma'am," Kevin replied politely. "It was just a matter of thinking through the system logically." Diane studied the boy with the same analytical attention she brought to evaluating potential business investments. What she saw was a child who spoke clearly and directly showed no signs of being intimidated by adult authority, and had apparently demonstrated genuine technical competence. "Your father operates Taylor Auto Repair on Main Street?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. He's taught me a lot about how different machines work." I can see that Diane glanced at her son, whose discomfort was becoming increasingly apparent. "Brett, perhaps you could explain to me exactly how this visit came to be arranged." The question carried the weight of maternal authority, combined with executive investigation skills. Brett shifted uncomfortably clearly, recognizing that his original plan had not only failed, but had potentially created a much larger problem for himself. "I just thought it would be interesting for Kevin to see real industrial equipment," Brett said weakly. His mother's expression suggested she found this explanation less than convincing. The growing crowd of workers, the video recording equipment, and Brett's obvious discomfort painted a picture that an experienced businesswoman could read without difficulty. "I see," Diane said in the tone that her employees recognized as preceding uncomfortable questions about poor decision-making. "And you thought this would be educational for everyone involved?" Before Brett could respond, Kevin spoke up with the innocent directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to navigate adult politics. "I think Brett was hoping I wouldn't be able to figure out the machine," Kevin said matter-of-factly, "but I really like learning about how things work, so it was interesting." Anyway, the simple honesty of the statement hit the gathering like a splash of cold water. Kevin's tone carried no accusation or resentment, just the straightforward observation of someone stating an obvious fact. But the implications were clear to every adult present. Brett had brought the boy here expecting him to fail, and that expectation said more about Brett's character than it did about Kevin's abilities. Diane Anderson's face shifted through several expressions as she processed this information. Disappointment, embarrassment, and anger competed for dominance as she realized her son had attempted to publicly humiliate a child for his own entertainment. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Frank Sullivan cleared his throat. "Mrs. Anderson, if it's all right with you, I'd like to add Kevin to our approved visitor list. Boy's got a natural understanding of mechanical systems that our training programs could benefit from." Observing the suggestion was both generous and pointed, acknowledging Kevin's demonstrated competence while implicitly criticizing Brett's intentions. Several workers nodded in agreement, creating a consensus that would be difficult for Diane to dismiss without seeming unreasonable. "That's an excellent suggestion." Frank Diane agreed, her tone carrying the authority of someone making an executive decision. I think we could all learn something. From fresh perspectives on problem solving, Brett's plan had not only failed spectacularly, but had created exactly the opposite outcome from what he had intended. Instead of humiliating Kevin Taylor, he had elevated the boy's status while exposing his own character to unflattering scrutiny. Worse, he had done so in front of his mother and a crowd of witnesses who would undoubtedly share the story throughout Brookton. As the group began to disperse, Kevin found himself at the center of attention. He had never sought surrounded by adults who wanted to discuss hydraulic systems, mechanical engineering, and the problem-solving approaches that had led to his success. For a boy who had been brought here as the target of a cruel joke, the day was turning out far differently than anyone had expected. The ride back to Taylor Auto Repair passed in uncomfortable silence. Brett gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw clenched so tightly that Kevin could hear his teeth grinding. Jake Morrison stared out the passenger window, his phone tucked away after capturing footage that had turned out very differently than expected. Brad Sterling shifted restlessly in the back seat, occasionally glancing at Kevin with an expression that mixed confusion with something approaching resentment. Kevin sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, watching the familiar streets of Brookton roll past. He understood that something significant had happened at the factory. Something that had changed the dynamic between himself and the older boys, but at 8 years old, he lacked the social experience to fully grasp the implications of making Brett Anderson look foolish in front of his mother and her employees. The BMW pulled into the gravel lot of Taylor Auto Repair with more force than necessary, sending small stones scattering against the building's brick facade through the open garage door. They could see Dave Taylor still working on the Ford pickup now, with the hood closed and the engine running. The sound of a properly tuned motor filled the afternoon air, a mechanical symphony that spoke of problems solved and work completed satisfactory. "Thanks for the ride," Kevin said politely as he climbed out of the expensive vehicle, his natural courtesy unaffected by the tension that had surrounded him for the past hour. Brett said nothing, but his eyes followed Kevin with an intensity that promised this encounter was far from over as the BMW pulled away in a cloud of dust and exhaust fumes. Kevin walked into the familiar embrace of his father's workshop, where the smell of motor oil and honest work provided a stark contrast to the sterile complexity of the Anderson plant. "How did it go, son?" Dave asked, emerging from beneath the hood with a socket wrench in his oil-stained hands. His eyes searched Kevin's face for signs of distress or humiliation, the protective instincts of a father who had reluctantly allowed his child into a potentially hostile situation. "It was interesting, Dad," Kevin replied, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing mechanical problems. Their hydraulic press had an isolation valve that was stuck partially closed. It took a few minutes to figure out, but it wasn't too complicated. Once you understood the system layout, Dave paused in his cleaning of the wrench, processing his son's words. "You mean you actually looked at their machine?" "I helped them fix it," Kevin said simply. "The foreman was really nice, and Mrs. Anderson said I could come back to visit and learn more about industrial equipment." The casual way Kevin delivered this information belied the significance of what had actually occurred. Dave expected his son to return either overwhelmed by equipment beyond his comprehension, or worse, humiliated by teenagers looking for entertainment at his expense. The idea that Kevin had not only held his own, but had actually contributed to solving a real problem was both surprising and concerning. "Kevin, tell me exactly what happened," Dave said. Setting down his tools and giving his son his full attention over the next 15 minutes, Kevin provided a detailed account of his visit to the Anderson plant. He described the hydraulic press with the precise technical vocabulary he had absorbed from years of listening to his father work, explained the diagnostic process that had led him to identify the valve problem, and recounted the reactions of the various adults who had witnessed his success. What Kevin didn't fully convey, because he lacked the social awareness to recognize it, was the extent to which his competence had disrupted Brett Anderson's carefully planned humiliation. He mentioned that Brett seemed disappointed when the machine was fixed, but attributed this to teenage impatience rather than malicious intent. Dave listened with growing amazement and concern. Pride in his son's abilities word with worry about the attention Kevin had attracted in a town like Brookton. Standing out could be dangerous. especially when it involved making powerful families look foolish. "Dad, is it bad that I knew how to fix their machine?" Kevin asked, picking up on his father's conflicted emotions with the sensitivity that had always made him seem older than his years. "No, son. It's not bad," Dave replied carefully. "You should never apologize for being smart or for helping people solve problems. I'm proud of you for using what you've learned. I just want to make sure you understand that not everyone appreciates being shown up by someone they underestimated." Before Kevin could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle. A dusty pickup truck pulled into the lot, and Gladys Turner climbed out with the deliberate movements of someone whose 70-year-old joints protested sudden motion. Gladys had been bringing her vehicles to Taylor Auto Repair since Dave first opened the shop, and she had become something of a fixture in Kevin's life, often staying to chat about mechanical problems and sharing stories from her 40-year career as a mathematics teacher. "Dave, Kevin," she called out as she approached the garage. "I just heard the most interesting story from my nephew Frank down at the Anderson plant." Dave's stomach dropped. Frank Sullivan was Gladys Turner's nephew, which meant that news of Kevin's success at the factory was already spreading through Brookton's interconnected family networks. In a small town, information traveled faster than gossip, and both moved at the speed of light. "What kind of story?" Mrs. Turner, Kevin asked with genuine curiosity. Gladys smiled with the particular warmth she reserved for bright children who reminded her of her favorite students, the kind where a young man uses his brain to solve a problem that had stumped a room full of adults. "Frank was very impressed with your hydraulic system diagnosis. It wasn't that hard once you looked at all the components," Kevin replied modestly. "Dad always says that machines tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen. Your father is a wise man." Gladys agreed, but her attention was focused on Dave rather than Kevin. Frank also mentioned that Brett Anderson was the one who brought Kevin to the plant. Said the boy seemed disappointed when Kevin succeeded. The observation carried weight, because Gladys Turner had taught 3 generations of Brookton children, including Brett Anderson. She had developed a teacher's instinct for recognizing the difference between genuine interest in learning and the kind of setup that older children sometimes arranged for their own amusement. "Mrs. Turner," Dave began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Dave, I've known the Anderson family for a long time. Brett's father was one of my students, and so was his mother. They're good people who've built something important for this community. But Brett himself?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Brett has always had trouble understanding that other people's value isn't determined by their family's bank account." The assessment was delivered with the authority of someone who had observed hundreds of children grow into adults and had learned to recognize character patterns early. Gladys had seen too many privileged children confuse inherited advantages with personal worth, and she had watched the damage such attitudes could inflict on less fortunate, but more capable peers. "What are you suggesting?" Dave asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I'm suggesting that Kevin's success today probably wasn't the outcome Brett was hoping for," Gladys replied frankly. "And young men like Brett don't usually accept that kind of embarrassment gracefully." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of squealing tires and loud music. A modified Honda Civic with an oversized exhaust system and bass speakers that could be heard 3 blocks away pulled into the lot with unnecessary drama. The driver was Danny Walsh, the 25-year-old son of a local family who had made poor choices his primary life strategy. "Hey, Dave," Danny called out as he climbed from the Civic, his voice carrying the artificial confidence that often masked deep insecurity. "Heard your kid made some big-shot engineers look stupid today." That true? Dave's jaw tightened if Danny Walsh had already heard about Kevin's success at the Anderson plant. It meant the story was spreading through every social circle in Brookton. Danny worked part-time at 3 different establishments and had connections throughout the town's network of bars, diners, and informal gathering places. Kevin helped solve a mechanical problem. Dave replied carefully, "Nothing more dramatic than that." "Come on, man, don't be modest." Danny persisted, his grin suggesting he found the whole situation entertaining. "Word is your 8-year-old showed up a whole crew of college-educated engineers. That's gotta feel good, right? Sticking it to the rich folks." Kevin looked uncomfortable with the attention and the way Danny seemed to be turning his technical success into some kind of social victory. The boy had helped fix a machine because he enjoyed solving mechanical problems. not because he wanted to prove anything about class differences or social status. It wasn't about showing anyone up. Kevin said quietly. I just like figuring out how things work. Danny laughed, apparently missing the sincerity in Kevin's voice. Kid, you just became a local legend, 8 years old, and already making the Anderson family look bad. Your dad must be proud as hell. Gladys Turner stepped forward with the authority of someone who had spent decades managing classroom dynamics. Danny, I think you're misunderstanding what happened today. Kevin demonstrated knowledge and problem-solving skills, which should be celebrated, but turning it into some kind of social conflict isn't helpful for anyone. Hey, Mrs. Turner, no disrespect, Danny replied, holding up his hands in mock surrender. I'm just saying it's nice to see one of our local kids showing those factory people that book learning isn't everything. Real experience counts for something too. The comment revealed Danny's own insecurities about his lack of formal education, but it also highlighted the complex social dynamics that Kevin's success had triggered in a community where economic opportunities were limited and class differences were sharp. Any perceived victory of working-class competence over privileged incompetence carried emotional weight that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances. Dave recognized the danger in allowing Kevin's technical achievement to be transformed into a symbol of social resentment. Such symbolism could make his son a target for retaliation while also placing unfair expectations on an 8-year-old who simply wanted to learn about machinery. Danny, I appreciate the sentiment, Dave said diplomatically. But Kevin's just a kid who likes to learn. Let's not make this into something bigger than it needs to be. Too late for that, Danny replied with a knowing grin. Story's already out there by tonight. Everyone in Brookton's going to know that Dave Taylor's boy made the Anderson family's fancy engineers look like amateurs. As if summoned by Danny's prediction, another vehicle pulled into the lot. This time it was a newer sedan driven by Rebecca Stone, a reporter for the Brookton Herald, the town's weekly newspaper. Rebecca was in her mid-30s, college-educated, and one of the few local journalists who took her job seriously enough to investigate stories rather than simply report gossip. Mr. Taylor, Rebecca called out as she approached the group. I'm hoping you might have a few minutes to discuss what happened at the Anderson plant today. I understand your son provided technical assistance that resolved a significant production problem. Dave felt the situation spiraling beyond his control. The presence of a newspaper reporter meant that Kevin's story would soon reach far beyond Brookton's informal gossip networks. Once the story appeared in print, it would take on a life of its own, potentially attracting attention from people and organizations that Dave wasn't prepared to deal with. Miss Stone, I don't think this is really newsworthy, Dave began, but Rebecca interrupted with the polite persistence of a professional journalist. Actually, Mr. Taylor, I think our readers would be very interested in the story about local talent and problem-solving capability. It's exactly the kind of positive news that Brookton needs, especially given some of the economic challenges we've been facing. Kevin stepped forward with the directness that had served him well at the factory. Ma'am, I just helped them figure out why their hydraulic press wasn't working. It was a stuck valve, which is a pretty common problem in complex systems. Rebecca smiled and pulled out a notebook, recognizing a good quote when she heard one. That's very modest of you, Kevin. But according to my source at the plant, several experienced technicians had been working on this problem for 3 days without success. Your solution saved the company thousands of dollars in lost production. Sometimes it helps to have fresh eyes look at a problem, Kevin replied, unconsciously echoing advice his father had given him many times. Adults sometimes miss simple solutions because they expect problems to be complicated. Gladys Turner watched this exchange with growing concern. She had seen enough bright children become overwhelmed by adult expectations to recognize the potential dangers in Kevin's sudden prominence. The boy was handling the attention with remarkable composure, but he was still only 8 years old. Rebecca Gladys interjected, perhaps we should consider Kevin's age before turning this into a major news story. He's accomplished something impressive, but he's still a child who deserves to have a normal childhood. Of course, Rebecca agreed quickly, but surely Mr. Taylor can see the value in sharing Kevin's story with the community. It demonstrates the talent and intelligence can emerge from anywhere, regardless of economic circumstances or family background. The reporter's words contained the same undercurrent that had appeared in Danny Walsh's comments. The idea that Kevin's success represented some kind of victory for working-class values. Overprivileged incompetence. Dave recognized the appeal of such a narrative, especially in a community that had seen too many economic disappointments, but he also understood the dangers of allowing his son to become a symbol rather than simply a bright kid who enjoyed mechanical problems, Miss Stone. Dave said finally, "Kevin's just a boy who likes to learn about how things work. If you want to write about that, I suppose that's fine, but I'd appreciate it if you kept the focus on education and curiosity rather than making this about social class or economics." Rebecca nodded professionally, but her expression suggested she understood exactly what kind of story would sell newspapers and generate reader interest. A simple story about a curious child would merit a brief mention on an inside page. A story about an 8-year-old working-class boy outperforming college-educated engineers would make the front page and might even attract attention from larger publications as the afternoon wore on, and more people stopped by the garage to hear about Kevin's adventure at the Anderson plant. Dave realized that his son's life had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. Kevin had demonstrated abilities that couldn't be hidden, and those abilities had attracted attention that couldn't be ignored. The boy himself seemed largely unaware of the broader implications of his success. He answered questions about hydraulic systems with the same patient detail he brought to any technical discussion, apparently viewing the entire experience as an interesting learning opportunity rather than a life-altering event. But Dave could see the future taking shape around his son's innocence, and he wasn't sure he liked what he saw. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made the mountains around Brookton look like a postcard, all golden leaves and morning mist. Kevin walked to school along his usual route, passing Henderson's Hardware and the empty lot where Murphy's Five and Dime used to stand before the economy forced another small business to close its doors. His backpack bounced against his shoulders, heavy with textbooks and the mechanical engineering manual that Gladys Turner had lent him the previous week at Brookton Elementary. Kevin noticed something different in the way other students looked at him. Word of his success at the Anderson plant had apparently reached the playground networks filtered through older siblings and overheard adult conversations. 8-year-olds might not understand hydraulic engineering, but they could recognize when one of their peers had done something that impressed grown-ups. Kevin called out Sarah Mitchell, a girl from his class, who usually ignored him in favor of the children whose families could afford brand-name clothes and the latest toys. "My mom says you fixed a big machine at the factory. Is that really true?" Before Kevin could answer, he found himself surrounded by a cluster of curious classmates, all wanting to hear about his adventure in the adult world of industrial machinery. The attention felt strange and uncomfortable, mainly because Kevin didn't understand why solving a mechanical problem should be more interesting than the dozens of other problems he helped his father solve every week. "It wasn't a big deal," Kevin replied with characteristic modesty. "Just a valve that was stuck. Once you understand how hydraulic systems work, it's pretty straightforward." Tommy Rodriguez, whose father worked as a welder at the Anderson plant, pushed forward with wide eyes. "My dad says the machine was worth millions of dollars and it was broken for 3 whole days. He says you saved the company. Lots of money." Kevin shrugged, genuinely puzzled by the excitement his technical work had generated. "Machines break down. Sometimes that's why people fix them. My dad does it every day with cars and trucks." Miss Rebecca Walsh, Kevin's 3rd-grade teacher, approached the gathering with the diplomatic skills that came from managing classroom dynamics for 5 years. At 29, she was young, enough to remember the social pressures of childhood while being experienced enough to recognize when a student needed protection from unwanted attention. "Good morning, Kevin," she said warmly. "I heard you had an interesting experience yesterday. Perhaps you'd like to share what you learned with the whole class during our science period." The suggestion was both an opportunity and a gentle redirection, offering Kevin a chance to discuss his technical interests in an educational context while moving the conversation away from playground gossip. Kevin nodded eagerly, always enthusiastic about any chance to talk about mechanical systems as the morning progressed. Kevin's classroom presentation about hydraulic engineering drew the kind of focused attention usually reserved for movies or surprise parties. He used the whiteboard to diagram basic hydraulic principles, explaining how pressure and flow work together to create mechanical force. His explanation was clear and methodical, showing the same natural teaching ability that would have impressed education professionals if any had been present to observe it. So the hydraulic fluid is like the muscles explained. 10-year-old Ashley Cooper trying to understand the concept, and the pressure is like the brain telling the muscles what to do. That's a good way to think about it. Kevin agreed. Except hydraulic systems can be much more precise than muscles, and they can generate forces that would be impossible for any person to create. Principal Johnson, passing by the classroom during his morning rounds, paused to listen through the open door. At 52, he had seen thousands of student presentations, but Kevin's combination of technical knowledge and natural teaching ability was exceptional for any age, let alone an 8-year-old. Meanwhile, across town at Anderson Manufacturing, the morning shift was discussing the previous day's events with the kind of detailed analysis that factory workers brought to any unusual occurrence. Frank Sullivan found himself fielding questions from employees who had heard various versions of Kevin's diagnostic success and wanted to know exactly what had happened. Kid knew more about hydraulic systems than some of our maintenance staff. Frank told a group gathered around the coffee machine, asked all the right questions, looked at the problem logically, and solved it in about 5 minutes. "How's that possible?" asked Linda. "Cooper, the safety inspector, he's just 8 years old age. Doesn't matter if you understand the principles," Frank replied. "Kid's been learning from his father since he could walk. Dave Taylor might run a small shop, but he knows machinery as well as anyone I've ever worked with." The conversation was overheard by Carlos Rivera, a recent engineering graduate who had joined Anderson Manufacturing 3 months earlier as part of their management training program. At 28, Carlos carried both the confidence that came from formal education and the insecurity that came from limited practical experience. Hearing factory workers praise an 8-year-old's technical abilities while questioning the competence of trained engineers touched on his deepest professional fears. "Come on, Frank," Carlos said, joining the conversation with forced casualness. "The kid probably just got lucky, made a random guess that happened to be right." Frank's expression cooled noticeably. As someone who had worked his way up from the factory floor, he had little patience for college graduates who dismissed practical knowledge in favor of theoretical credentials. "Wasn't luck," Carlos, Frank replied firmly. Kid understood the system, architecture, knew which components to check first, and explained his reasoning every step of the way. "That's not guessing, that's troubleshooting. But he has no formal training," Carlos persisted. "No engineering degree, no certification programs. How could he possibly understand complex industrial systems better than trained professionals?" The question revealed more about Carlos's own insecurities than about Kevin's abilities. But it also highlighted a tension that existed throughout American industry, the gap between formal education and practical competence. Frank had seen too many engineering graduates struggle with real-world applications to be impressed by degrees. "Alone training comes in different forms," Frank said quietly. "Some people learn from books and classrooms. Others learn from watching, listening, and getting their hands dirty. Both kinds of knowledge have value." Back at Brookton Elementary, Kevin's school day was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a mechanical engineering professor from West Virginia University, arrived during lunch period with the kind of professional urgency that suggested important business. She had driven 3 hours from Morgantown after receiving a phone call from her colleague, Dr. William Carter at MIT, who had heard about Kevin's factory success through academic networks that moved faster than small-town gossip. Principal Johnson met Dr. Mitchell in his office, a cramped space decorated with student artwork and motivational posters that spoke of limited budgets and unlimited optimism. The contrast between the elementary school environment and Dr. Mitchell's university credentials created an surreal atmosphere, as if two different worlds were attempting to occupy the same space. "Principal Johnson, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." Dr. Mitchell began, settling into a child-sized chair that made her look uncomfortably oversized. "I understand you have a student who demonstrated remarkable engineering aptitude yesterday at the Anderson plant." "Kevin Taylor," Principal Johnson confirmed. "Bright boy, always been interested in how things work. His father runs an auto repair shop and Kevin spends most of his free time there, learning about mechanical systems. I'd like to meet with Kevin, if that's possible," Dr. Mitchell said. What he accomplished yesterday suggests abilities that might benefit from more advanced educational opportunities. The principal's expression became cautious. He had dealt with enough well-meaning professionals to recognize when someone was about to disrupt a child's life in the name of their best interest. Dr. Mitchell Kevin's just 8 years old. He's a good student, but he's still a little boy who needs to play and learn at his own pace. Of course, Dr. Mitchell agreed quickly. I'm not suggesting anything drastic, but talent like this should be nurtured appropriately. There are programs, opportunities that could help Kevin develop his abilities while still maintaining a normal childhood principle. Johnson studied the engineering professor, trying to assess her intentions. Academic talent scouts had visited Brookton before, usually offering opportunities that sounded wonderful, but came with hidden costs that working families couldn't afford. What kind of opportunities, he asked carefully. Summer engineering camps, mentorship programs, access to university laboratories during school breaks, nothing that would interfere with his regular education, but supplements that could help him explore his interests more deeply. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Miss Walsh entered with Kevin in tow, having been summoned from his classroom without explanation. The boy looked curious but unworried, accustomed to being called to the principal's office for positive rather than disciplinary reasons. Kevin, Principal Johnson said, "This is Dr. Mitchell from West Virginia University. She'd like to talk with you about what happened yesterday at the factory." Kevin looked at Dr. Mitchell with polite attention, extending his hand for a handshake that she accepted with visible surprise at his mature manner. "Hello, Dr. Mitchell," Kevin said. "Are you an engineer?" "I am," she replied, smiling at his directness. "I teach mechanical engineering at the university, and I research new approaches to industrial automation." Kevin's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "That sounds really interesting. Do you work with hydraulic systems?" "Sometimes," Dr. Mitchell said, already impressed by Kevin's focus on technical rather than personal details. "But I'm more interested in hearing about your experience yesterday. Can you tell me how you approached the problem at the Anderson plant?" Over the next 20 minutes, Kevin provided a detailed technical explanation that demonstrated not only his understanding of the specific hydraulic issue, but also his broader grasp of mechanical engineering principles. He drew diagrams on Principal Johnson's whiteboard, explained system relationships with clear logic, and answered Dr. Mitchell's increasingly complex questions with confidence and accuracy. "Kevin," Dr. Mitchell said finally, "have you ever thought about what you'd like to do when you grow up?" "I want to help my dad with the garage," Kevin replied without hesitation. "And maybe design better engines for cars and trucks. I think there are lots of ways to make vehicles more efficient and reliable." The answer revealed both Kevin's loyalty to his family and his natural inclination toward practical applications of engineering knowledge. Dr. Mitchell recognized the significance of both elements: family support that had nurtured his abilities and personal interests that aligned with real-world problem-solving. "Those are excellent goals," she said, "and there are many ways to prepare for that kind of career. Would you be interested in learning more about engineering through some special programs?" Kevin looked uncertain for the first time in the conversation. "What kind of programs?" "Summer camps where you could work with other young people who love engineering, visits to university laboratories where you could see advanced research, maybe some correspondence courses that would let you learn more about automotive design." "Would I still be able to help my dad at the garage?" Kevin asked, his priorities clearly established. "Absolutely." Dr. Mitchell assured him these would be additions to what you're already doing, not replacements. Kevin considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That sounds interesting, but I'd need to ask my dad first. He makes the important decisions." Dr. Mitchell smiled, recognizing both Kevin's respect for parental authority and his practical approach to new opportunities. "Of course, would it be possible for me to meet with your father this afternoon?" Before Kevin could answer, the conversation was interrupted by commotion from the hallway outside the principal's office. Raised voices and the sound of rapid footsteps suggested some kind of emergency or conflict. Principal Johnson rose from his desk and opened the door to investigate. In the hallway, they could see Brett Anderson and two of his friends from Brookton High School standing near the elementary school's main entrance. Brett was arguing with Mrs. Helen Garcia, the school secretary, who was clearly trying to prevent the teenagers from proceeding further into the building. "I just want to talk to the kid," Brett was saying, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. 5 minutes, that's all, young man. You cannot simply walk into an elementary school and demand to see a student. Mrs. Garcia replied firmly, there are procedures, and your request is highly inappropriate. Principal Johnson stepped into the hallway with the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Brett, what are you doing here? Mr. Johnson, I need to speak with Kevin Taylor, Brett said, trying to project reasonable calm despite the obvious tension in his posture. There's been a misunderstanding about what happened yesterday, and I want to clear it up. Dr. Mitchell, observing from the doorway of the principal's office, recognized the social dynamics immediately. She had seen enough academic politics to understand when someone was attempting damage control after a public embarrassment. Brett, Principal Johnson said carefully, Kevin is in class, and you have no business being in this building without permission. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is important. Brett insisted, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. People are telling stories about yesterday that aren't true, and it's affecting my family's reputation. The admission revealed more than Brett had intended. His presence at the elementary school wasn't about clarifying misunderstandings. It was about controlling a narrative that had spiraled beyond his ability to manage. Kevin's success had not only humiliated Brett in front of his mother and her employees, but had also created a story that was spreading throughout Brooklyn in ways that made the Anderson family look foolish. Whatever happened yesterday, Principal Johnson said firmly, it doesn't give you the right to confront an 8-year-old child at his school. You need to leave immediately, or I'll call the police. Brett's friends Jake Morrison and Brad Sterling exchanged uncomfortable glances. What had seemed like a reasonable plan to confront Kevin and demand that he correct the exaggerated stories about his factory success now looked like harassment of an elementary school student by 3 high school teenagers. This isn't over, Brett said quietly, his words carrying a promise that made Dr. Mitchell step protectively closer to Kevin as the teenagers finally left the building. Principal Johnson realized that Kevin's life had become more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The boy's technical success had attracted not only positive attention from educators and professionals, but also negative attention from people who felt threatened by his abilities. Kevin himself seemed largely unaware of the broader implications of Brett's visit. But Dr. Mitchell understood that the situation required careful handling. An 8-year-old boy with extraordinary abilities was now caught between competing adult interests, and protecting him would require more than academic opportunities or family support. That afternoon, Dave Taylor found himself in the unusual position of hosting a university professor in his cramped garage office, a space barely large enough for 2 folding chairs and a desk made from an old workbench. Dr. Sarah Mitchell sat carefully on one of the chairs, her professional attire looking oddly formal amid the automotive calendars and parts catalogs that decorated the walls. The contrast between her academic credentials and the blue-collar environment created a tension that both adults could feel but neither acknowledged directly. Mr. Taylor, I want to be clear about my intentions. Dr. Mitchell began, setting down her briefcase with deliberate care. I'm not here to disrupt Kevin's life or pressure your family into decisions you're not comfortable making. Dave leaned against the workbench, his arms crossed in a posture that suggested polite skepticism. Dr. Mitchell, I appreciate you coming all this way, but Kevin's just 8 years old. He's got plenty of time to figure out what he wants to do with his life. Of course, she agreed. But exceptional abilities like Kevin's are rare, and they require appropriate nurturing to develop fully. I'm simply suggesting opportunities that could complement what you're already teaching him. Through the open door to the garage, they could see Kevin organizing tools with the methodical precision that characterized everything he did. Each wrench found its designated place, each socket returned to its proper position. In the set, it was the kind of systematic approach that spoke of a mind that naturally imposed order on complexity. What kind of opportunities? Dave asked, echoing the caution that Principal Johnson had shown earlier. Dr. Mitchell opened her briefcase and extracted several colorful brochures. Summer engineering programs designed for gifted children, correspondence courses that could provide advanced mathematics and physics, instruction, access to university laboratories during school breaks where Kevin could observe real engineering research. Dave studied the materials, noting the photographs of children working with sophisticated equipment in pristine laboratory settings. Everything looked expensive and far removed from the practical hands-on learning that had shaped Kevin's education. Thus far, Dr. Mitchell, These programs look impressive, but I'm not sure they're right for Kevin. He learns best by working with his hands solving real problems. I'm not convinced that academic programs would add much to what he's already getting. I understand your concern, Dr. Mitchell replied diplomatically. But Kevin's analytical abilities suggest he could benefit from more theoretical knowledge to complement his practical skills. Understanding the mathematical principles behind hydraulic systems, for example, could help him solve even more complex problems. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the street. Outside through the garage door, they could see a crowd gathering around Henderson's hardware. Next door, raised voices and the sound of an argument suggested some kind of conflict that was drawing spectators from neighboring businesses. Kevin looked up from his tool organization, his expression shifting to concern as he recognized some of the voices involved in the dispute. "Dad, I think that's Mrs. Henderson arguing with." Music. Someone Dave stepped outside to investigate, followed by Dr. Mitchell and Kevin on the sidewalk in front of Henderson's hardware. They found elderly Mrs. Henderson facing off against Carlos Rivera, the young engineer from Anderson Manufacturing. Carlos was holding a clipboard and gesturing emphatically, while Mrs. Henderson stood her ground with the stubborn determination of someone who had been running a small business for 30 years. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm just trying to explain the safety regulations," Carlos was saying, his voice carrying the frustrated tone of someone whose authority wasn't being recognized. "The new industrial safety standards require all businesses within a 4-mile of the manufacturing plant to upgrade their electrical systems." "Young man, I've been running this store since before you were born," Mrs. Henderson replied sharply. "My electrical system was installed by certified electricians and has never caused a single problem." A crowd of perhaps 20 people had gathered to watch the confrontation, including several customers from Dave's garage and workers from the manufacturing plant who were passing by during shift change. The presence of an audience had transformed what might have been a routine bureaucratic interaction into a public showdown between local tradition and corporate authority. Frank Sullivan emerged from the crowd, his expression grim. "Carlos, what's this about Mrs. Henderson's hardware store has been here longer than the plant?" "Frank, this isn't personal," Carlos replied clearly, uncomfortable with the public nature of the conversation. "These are federal safety requirements. Every business in the designated zone needs to comply with updated electrical codes. Funny how these requirements show up right after an 8-year-old boy makes your engineering department look incompetent," called out Danny Walsh from the edge of the crowd, his comment drawing murmurs of agreement from several spectators. Dr. Mitchell watched this exchange with the analytical attention of someone studying social dynamics. The connection between Kevin's factory success and the sudden appearance of new safety requirements was too convenient to be coincidental, but proving deliberate retaliation would be difficult. "Mrs. Henderson," Kevin said, stepping forward with the directness that had served him well in adult conversations, "what exactly do they want you to change about your electrical system?" The elderly store owner looked down at Kevin with the affection she reserved for the few children who treated her with genuine respect. "They say I need to install new circuit breakers and upgrade all my outlet boxes, going to cost me $3. Zero. I don't have." Kevin studied the front of Henderson's hardware with the same systematic attention he had brought to the hydraulic press problem. The building was old, but well-maintained, with electrical work that looked professional and up to code. After a moment, he turned to Carlos with a question that cut to the heart of the issue. "Mr. Rivera, do you have the specific code violations documented? Because Mrs. Henderson's electrical system looks like it meets standard commercial requirements." Carlos shifted uncomfortably, consulting his clipboard with the obvious delay tactics of someone buying time to formulate a response. "The violations are technical in nature, complex electrical engineering concepts that would be difficult to explain to someone without proper training." The condescending tone was a mistake that Carlos realized immediately. The crowd's mood shifted perceptibly, with several people taking offense at the implication that local business owners weren't intelligent enough to understand electrical codes. Frank Sullivan stepped forward with the authority of someone who had supervised electrical installations for 20 years. "Carlos, that I've been working with electrical systems since you were in grade school. Why don't you try explaining these violations to me, Frank? This is really a matter for the safety inspection department," Carlos replied evasively. "I'm just here to inform Mrs. Henderson about the compliance requirements." Kevin approached Mrs. Henderson's storefront, and began examining the electrical meter and main service panel with the focused attention that adults had learned to take seriously. After a few minutes, he turned back to Carlos with a question that demonstrated more technical knowledge than the young engineer had expected. Mr. Rivera, Mrs. Henderson's system is rated for 200 amps with proper grounding and GFCI protection in wet areas. What specific code sections does this violate? Carlos's face reened as he realized that an 8-year-old boy was exposing his lack of specific technical knowledge in front of a crowd that included his factory colleagues. The truth was that Carlos had been sent to pressure Mrs. Henderson based on vague instructions from management, without being given actual documentation of code violations. "Look, kid," Carlos said, his professional composure finally cracking. "This is adult business involving complex regulations that you couldn't possibly understand." The comment was another serious mistake. Kevin had just demonstrated detailed knowledge of electrical codes, and dismissing his competence in such a condescending manner made Carlos look both ignorant and arrogant. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with the diplomatic skills that came from years of academic committee work. "Mr. Rivera, perhaps it would be helpful if Mrs. Henderson could see the specific documentation of these alleged violations. Surely she has a right to understand exactly what modifications are being required and why the documentation is being prepared by the main office," Carlos replied weakly, clearly realizing that his position was becoming untenable. Frank Sullivan's expression had shifted from confusion to understanding. "Carlos, are you telling us that you came here to demand expensive electrical modifications without having actual documentation of code violations?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, because that was exactly what had happened. Carlos had been dispatched on a harassment mission disguised as safety enforcement, and Kevin's technical questions had exposed the lack of substance behind the demands. "This is harassment," he declared Mrs. Henderson, her voice carrying the righteous anger of someone who had finally understood the true nature of the situation. "You're trying to force me out of business because that boy made your people look bad yesterday." The crowd's murmur of agreement suggested that Mrs. Henderson's assessment reflected the general consensus. Several people began talking at once, expressing outrage at what appeared to be corporate retaliation against the entire community because of Kevin's factory success. "Now wait just a minute," Carlos protested, but his voice was drowned out by the growing anger of the crowd. Dave Taylor realized that the situation was spiraling out of control, and that his son had somehow become the focal point of a community-wide conflict. Kevin's technical competence had not only humiliated the Anderson family, but had also triggered a broader confrontation between corporate authority and local independence. "People, let's calm down," Dave called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone respected throughout. "The community getting angry isn't going to solve anything." "Dave's right," Frank Sullivan agreed, "but we need to get to the bottom of this. Carlos, I want to see the official documentation for these electrical violations by tomorrow morning, or I'm filing a complaint with the State Labor Department." Carlos looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him and realized that his mission had not only failed but had created a public relations disaster for Anderson Manufacturing. What had been intended as subtle pressure against Mrs. Henderson had become a community-wide controversy that would be difficult to contain. I'll check with the main office about the documentation," Carlos said finally, backing toward his car with obvious relief at finding an exit strategy. As Carlos drove away, the crowd began to disperse, but not before several people stopped to congratulate Kevin on his technical knowledge and to express support for Mrs. Henderson. The boy found himself at the center of attention once again, though he clearly would have preferred to return to organizing tools in his father's garage. Dr. Mitchell had observed the entire confrontation with growing concern. Kevin's abilities had not only attracted positive academic attention, but had also made him a target for retaliation by people who felt threatened by his competence. The situation was becoming more complex than a simple question of educational opportunities. "Mr. Taylor," she said quietly as the crowd dispersed, "I think we need to discuss Kevin's situation more seriously. His abilities have clearly made some people uncomfortable, and that could create ongoing problems for your family." Dave nodded grimly. "Dr. Mitchell, I've been thinking the same thing. Kevin's just a boy who likes to fix things, but apparently that's more threatening than I realized." Kevin looked up at his father with the perceptive awareness that had always made him seem older than his years. "Dad, are we in trouble because I fixed their machine?" The innocent question cut to the heart of the issue. An 8-year-old boy had solved a technical problem, and instead of being celebrated for his contribution, he was becoming the target of adult conflicts that he couldn't understand or control. "No, son," Dave replied carefully. "You did exactly the right thing. But sometimes when people feel embarrassed, they react badly." Instead of learning from their mistakes, Dr. Mitchell realized that her original plan to offer Kevin educational opportunities had become secondary to the more immediate need to protect him from the consequences of his own abilities. The boy's technical competence had created a situation that required careful management, and simply sending him to summer engineering camps wasn't going to address the real challenges he faced. "Mr. Taylor," she said, "finally, perhaps we should discuss not just educational opportunities for Kevin, but also strategies for helping him navigate the adult reactions to his abilities. This situation is more complex than I initially realized." Dave looked at his son, who was now helping Mrs. Henderson examine her electrical system, with the same focused attention he brought to any technical problem. Kevin remained unaware that his competence had created enemies as well as admirers, and Dave wasn't sure how to protect that innocence while still allowing the boy to develop his natural gifts. As the afternoon shadows grew longer across Main Street, it became clear that Kevin Taylor's life had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. His 8-year-old curiosity and mechanical aptitude had triggered consequences that would affect not only his own future, but the entire community of Brookton, West Virginia. The Brookton Herald hit the newsstands on Thursday morning with a front-page headline that sent shockwaves through the small community. "Local boy genius solves factory crisis, while corporate harassment targets family." Supporters Rebecca Stone's article filled nearly half the front page, complete with a photograph of Kevin examining Mrs. Henderson's electrical system, and quotes from factory workers praising his technical abilities at Anderson Manufacturing. Diane Anderson sat in her corner office reading the newspaper, with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for quarterly financial reports. The article portrayed her company as a corporate bully, retaliating against an 8-year-old boy's family and their supporters, while presenting Kevin Taylor as a young David, facing down an industrial Goliath. The public relations damage was immediate and significant. "Get me Carlos Rivera and my son in here immediately," Diane told her assistant, her voice carrying the edge that employees recognized as a warning of serious consequences. 15 minutes later, Carlos stood in front of Diane's desk, looking like a man facing his own execution, while Brett slumped in a chair beside him with the sullen expression of a teenager who knew he was in serious trouble. The newspaper lay open between them, a printed record of their spectacular failure. In judgment, "Explain to me," Diane began, her voice dangerously quiet, how an attempt to quietly pressure a hardware store owner turned into front-page headlines about corporate harassment of children. Carlos cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Anderson." The situation escalated beyond what we anticipated. The Taylor boy appeared and started asking technical questions that complicated our approach. "Technical questions that you apparently couldn't answer," Diane observed coldly. "According to this article, an 8-year-old child exposed the fact that you had no actual documentation of electrical violations." Brett shifted uncomfortably in his chair, realizing that his mother's investigation was uncovering the full extent of their ill-conceived retaliation campaign. "Mom, we were just trying to protect the family's reputation. After what happened at the factory, protect our reputation?" Diane's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her professional composure. "Brett, you brought an 8-year-old to our factory intending to humiliate him, failed spectacularly when he solved a problem our engineers couldn't handle, and then launched a harassment campaign that's now front-page news. How exactly does any of that protect our reputation?" The question hung in the air while both men struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't make their situation worse. Carlos had never seen Diane Anderson this angry, and Brett was beginning to understand that his privileged position as the owner's son wouldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, at Taylor Auto Repair, Dave found himself dealing with an entirely different set of problems. The newspaper article had transformed Kevin from a local curiosity into something approaching a regional celebrity, and the phone hadn't stopped ringing all morning. Reporters, From Charleston and Pittsburgh wanted interviews engineering professors from 3 different universities had called about educational opportunities, and several television stations were requesting permission to film Kevin working in the garage. "Dad, why do all these people want to talk to me?" Kevin asked, looking up from the transmission he was helping his father rebuild. "I just helped fix one machine." Dave set down his wrench and studied his son's genuinely puzzled expression at 8 years. Old Kevin couldn't comprehend how his technical competence had become entangled with broader issues of social class, corporate power, and community identity that had little to do with hydraulic engineering. Kevin, sometimes when people do something, well, it gets more attention than they expected. Dave explained carefully. The problem is that not all attention is good attention. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Gladys Turner, who entered the garage with the brisk efficiency of someone on a mission. She carried a manila folder and wore the expression of someone who had been thinking hard about complex problems. "Dave, Kevin," she said without preamble, "we need to talk about what happens next." Gladys spread several documents across Dave's workbench, including copies of the newspaper article, printouts of internet discussions about Kevin's story, and what appeared to be legal paperwork. "This situation is getting out of hand," she continued. "Kevin's story has been picked up by news websites in 3 states, and the commentary sections are filled with people arguing about everything from education policy to corporate responsibility. Your son has become a symbol in debates." He knows nothing about Dave studied the documents with growing alarm. Online forums were filled with discussions about working-class genius versus corporate incompetence and the failure of formal education to recognize practical intelligence. Kevin's simple act of mechanical troubleshooting had been transformed into ammunition for dozens of political and social arguments. "Mrs. Turner, what are you suggesting we do?" Dave asked. "I'm suggesting you get ahead of this before it gets worse," Gladys replied. "Firmly, I've spoken with an attorney who specializes in protecting children from unwanted media attention. We need to establish some boundaries before this circus completely takes over your lives." Kevin looked up from the transmission with the practical curiosity that characterized his approach to all problems. "Mrs. Turner, why are people arguing about me fixing a machine? Machines break. People fix them. That's how it's supposed to work." The innocence of the question highlighted exactly why the situation was so problematic. Kevin's technical success had triggered adult conflicts that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with social insecurities, economic tensions, and the complex dynamics of small-town politics. At Brookton Elementary Principal, Johnson was dealing with his own set of challenges. The school parking lot contained 3 news vans, and reporters were attempting to interview parents and teachers about Kevin's abilities. Several parents had called, demanding that their children be given the same educational opportunities being offered to Kevin, while others complained that too much attention was being paid to one student. "This is completely inappropriate," Mrs. Garcia, the school secretary, complained as she watched reporters through the office window. "These people are treating our school like it's some kind of circus." Principal Johnson nodded grimly. "Call the state education department and ask about policies for protecting students from media attention. We need legal guidance before this gets any worse." The situation at school was further complicated by the arrival of Dr. William Carter from MIT, who had driven from Boston after reading about Kevin in online engineering forums. Dr. Carter was a distinguished professor with silver hair and the kind of academic credentials that impressed other academics. But his presence at an elementary school in rural West Virginia created exactly the kind of spectacle that Principal Johnson was trying to avoid. Principal Johnson, "I realize this is highly unusual," Dr. Carter said as he settled into the same child-sized chair that Dr. Mitchell had occupied the day before. "But Kevin Taylor's abilities represent something truly exceptional. We have programs at MIT designed specifically for children with his level of technical intuition." Dr. Carter, with all due respect, Kevin is 8 years old and his father runs an auto repair shop. I'm not sure that MIT programs are appropriate for his circumstances. That's exactly the kind of thinking that allows exceptional talent to be wasted," Dr. Carter replied with the passionate intensity of someone accustomed to academic debates. "Genius doesn't respect social boundaries or economic circumstances. This boy could revolutionize mechanical engineering if given proper opportunities." The conversation was interrupted by commotion from the hallway through the office window. They could see Brett Anderson and several of his friends approaching the main entrance, apparently undeterred by their previous confrontation with school security. "Not again," Principal Johnson muttered, rising from his desk, with the weary determination of someone facing a recurring problem. This time Brett wasn't alone. Jake Morrison and Brad Sterling flanked him, but they were accompanied by two older teenagers that Principal Johnson didn't recognize. The group moved with the predatory confidence of people who had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. "Mr. Johnson," Brett called out as he entered the building, ignoring Mrs. Garcia's protests about proper check-in procedures. "I need to speak with Kevin Taylor immediately. This has gone too far, Brett. I told you yesterday that you cannot simply walk into this school and demand to see students." Principal Johnson replied firmly, "You need to leave immediately. I'm not leaving until I talk to that kid." Brett said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that made Dr. Carter look up with alarm. "He needs to tell people the truth about what happened at the factory, instead of letting everyone think he's some kind of genius." The demand revealed the depth of Brett's frustration and humiliation. The newspaper article had transformed Kevin from an 8-year-old who got lucky into a symbol of working-class competence, triumphing over privileged incompetence, and Brett couldn't tolerate being cast as the villain in that narrative. "Young man," Dr. Carter interjected, stepping into the hallway with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. Kevin Taylor demonstrated genuine engineering competence. There's nothing false about his abilities. Brett turned to face the MIT professor with barely controlled anger. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Dr. William Carter, Professor of Mechanical Engineering at Massachusetts Institute of Technology." Dr. Carter replied with the precision that academics brought to establishing credentials. "I've reviewed the technical details of Kevin's diagnostic work, and his understanding of hydraulic systems is remarkable for someone of any age." The endorsement from a distinguished professor should have settled the argument, but it only seemed to fuel Brett's frustration instead of acknowledging Kevin's competence. Brett was doubling down on the belief that an 8-year-old couldn't possibly understand complex engineering better than trained adults. "This is ridiculous," Brett said loudly. "Everyone's acting like this kid is some kind of miracle worker because he got lucky with one guess." "It wasn't luck," said a new voice from the entrance. Everyone turned to see Frank Sullivan entering the school, still wearing his work clothes. From the factory behind him came Tony Marcelli and two other Anderson Manufacturing employees, all looking like men who had decided that enough was enough. "Brett," Frank said with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student, "I watched Kevin diagnose that hydraulic problem step by step. He understood the system, architecture, asked the right questions, and solved it methodically." "That's not luck, that's competence, Frank. You're factory workers," Brett replied dismissively. "What would you know about real engineering?" The comment was a catastrophic mistake that revealed Brett's fundamental misunderstanding of both engineering and the people who worked for his family's company. Frank Sullivan had 20 years of hands-on experience with industrial machinery, and dismissing his professional judgment as worthless was both insulting and stupid. Brett, Tony Marcelli said quietly, "Your mother didn't build this company by dismissing the knowledge of the people who actually operate the equipment." The simple statement carried more weight than any academic endorsement because it came from someone who understood both the technical requirements of manufacturing and the business realities that Diane Anderson faced every day. Tony was pointing out that Brett's attitude was not only wrong, but was also fundamentally at odds with the principles that had made Anderson Manufacturing successful. Principal Johnson realized that the situation was moving beyond his ability to control what had started as a confrontation between a high school bully and an elementary school student had evolved into a community-wide debate about competence, respect, and the value of different types of knowledge. "Everyone needs to calm down," he said firmly. "This is an elementary school, not a public forum for debating engineering qualifications." "Mr. Johnson's right," Frank agreed. "But Brett needs to understand that Kevin Taylor earned the respect he's getting. Nobody's making up stories or exaggerating what happened. The boy solved a real problem that had stumped our maintenance team for 3 days." Brett looked around at the faces surrounding him and realized that his position was completely isolated. Not only had he failed to discredit Kevin's abilities, but his attempts to do so had only reinforced the narrative that portrayed him as a privileged teenager who couldn't accept being outperformed by a working-class child. This isn't over, Brett said, finally echoing his threat from the previous day. But this time his words carried less conviction and more desperation. The hollow bravado of someone who was running out of options as Brett and his friends finally left the building. Principal Johnson turned to Dr. Carter with an expression of deep concern. Dr. Carter, I think Kevin Taylor's situation has become more complex than any of us anticipated. This boy needs protection as much as he needs educational opportunities. Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. I've seen academic politics, but never anything quite like this. Perhaps we need to consider not just how to develop Kevin's abilities, but how to shield him from the consequences of having them. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dave Taylor, who had driven to the school after hearing about the latest confrontation from Mrs. Garcia's panicked phone call. His face carried the grim expression of a father who was beginning to understand that his son's life had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. Principal Johnson, Dave said as he entered the office, I think it's time we had a serious discussion about how to protect Kevin from all this attention. As the adults gathered to discuss Kevin's future, the 8-year-old boy at the center of the controversy was sitting in his third-grade classroom, completely absorbed in a math worksheet about geometric shapes. He remained blissfully unaware that his simple act of mechanical problem-solving had triggered a community-wide crisis that was still escalating beyond anyone's ability to control. Friday evening brought an unexpected visitor to the Anderson family estate, a sprawling colonial house that overlooked Brookton from the affluent hillside where the town's most successful families had built their homes. Dr. Jennifer Wallace from West Virginia University stood on the front porch, her briefcase in one hand and a manila folder in the other, waiting for someone to answer the doorbell that had echoed through the marble foyer. Diane Anderson opened the door herself, having dismissed the household staff early after a day of damage control meetings at the factory. She wore casual clothes for the first time in weeks, the kind of comfortable attire that suggested a woman who had temporarily set aside her corporate armor to deal with family problems. Dr. Wallace, Diane said, recognizing the professor from university board meetings they had both attended. This is unexpected. Mrs. Anderson, I apologize for the unannounced visit, but I think we need to discuss the situation involving young Kevin Taylor before it causes more damage to everyone involved. Diane stepped aside to allow Dr. Wallace entry, leading her into a living room decorated with the kind of understated elegance that came from having money without needing to prove it. Through the large windows they could see the lights of Brookton spread across the valley below, a reminder of the community that both women served in their different ways. Dr. Wallace, I assume you've read the newspaper coverage. Diane began settling into a leather chair that had probably cost more than most families in Brookton spent on furniture in a year. I have, and I've also reviewed the technical details of Kevin's diagnostic work at your factory, Dr. Wallace replied, opening her manila folder to reveal several pages of handwritten notes. Mrs. Anderson, that boy demonstrated genuine engineering insight that goes far beyond lucky guessing. Diane's expression shifted to something approaching resignation. Dr. Wallace, I'm beginning to understand that what I'm struggling with is how to address the damage my son has caused, while also doing right by Kevin and his family. The admission revealed more about Diane's character than hours of corporate meetings could have accomplished. Despite her wealth and position, she retained enough fundamental decency to recognize when her family had acted badly and to feel genuine remorse about the consequences. Mrs. Anderson, I think there might be a way to transform this situation into something positive for everyone involved, Dr. Wallace said carefully, but it would require your son to make some difficult acknowledgments about his behavior. Before Diane could respond, Brett himself appeared in the living room doorway, looking like someone who had been eavesdropping on the conversation. His usual arrogant confidence had been replaced by something closer to sullen defensiveness, the demeanor of someone who knew he was in serious trouble but hadn't yet accepted responsibility for his actions. Brett, Diane said firmly, Dr. Wallace and I are discussing the Kevin Taylor situation. You need to hear this. Brett slouched into a chair across from Dr. Wallace with the theatrical reluctance of a teenager being forced to endure adult lectures about responsibility. What's there to discuss? Everyone's acting like this kid is some kind of genius because he fixed one machine. Dr. Wallace studied Brett with the analytical attention she brought to evaluating struggling students. recognizing the combination of privilege, insecurity, and wounded pride that had created the current crisis. Brett, I've spent 20 years working with engineering students, and I can tell you that Kevin's diagnostic process was remarkable for someone of any age. She said quietly, "Your refusal to acknowledge his competence says more about your character than it does about his abilities." The direct assessment hit Brett like a physical blow, partly because it came from someone whose credentials he couldn't dismiss, and partly because it forced him to confront truths he had been avoiding. "He's 8 years old." Brett protested weakly. "How can an 8-year-old understand hydraulic systems better than trained engineers?" "Age doesn't determine understanding." Dr. Wallace replied, "Kevin has been learning mechanical principles since he could walk, and he's had excellent teaching from his father. More importantly, he approaches problems with genuine curiosity, rather than the assumption that his social status entitles him to easy answers." The comparison was pointed and deliberate, highlighting the fundamental difference between Kevin's intellectual humility and Brett's entitled arrogance. Diane watched her son process this assessment, seeing him struggle with concepts that challenged everything he had been taught about his place in the world. Meanwhile, across town at Taylor Auto Repair, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. The garage had been closed to regular customers for the evening, but the space was filled with people who had come to discuss Kevin's future. Dave and Linda Taylor sat on folding chairs brought from the community center, while Kevin played quietly in the corner with a disassembled carburetor that had been beyond economic repair. "We need to establish some ground rules before this gets any more out of hand," said attorney William Barnes, a balding man in his late 40s who specialized in protecting families from unwanted media attention. "Kevin's rights as a minor need to be protected, regardless of his exceptional abilities." Frank Sullivan nodded agreement. From his position near the workbench, the factory workers support Kevin completely, but we're worried about the pressure he's under. Boy shouldn't have to deal with reporters and college professors wanting to turn him into some kind of exhibit doctor. Sarah Mitchell, who had driven back from Morgantown after hearing about the week's escalating events, leaned forward with genuine concern. "I want to help Kevin develop his abilities, but not at the cost of his childhood or family stability. We need to find approaches that nurture his gifts without exploiting them." That is Turner, who had been observing the discussion with the patient attention of someone who had mediated countless difficult situations, finally spoke up. "The question isn't whether Kevin should receive advanced educational opportunities. The question is how to provide those opportunities while protecting him from people who want to use his story for their own purposes." Kevin looked up from the carburetor with the alert expression of someone who had been following the adult conversation despite appearing absorbed in mechanical work. "Are you talking about me going to different schools?" Dave felt his heart tighten, and the innocent question. His son's simple curiosity about educational opportunities had somehow become entangled with complex issues of media attention, corporate politics, and academic competition that no 8-year-old should have to navigate. "Kevin, we're talking about ways to help you learn more about engineering while making sure you can still help me at the garage and go to school with your friends," Dave explained carefully. "That sounds good," Kevin replied with characteristic directness. "I like learning new things, but I don't want to go away from home." The statement cut through hours of academic discussions with the clarity that only children could provide. Kevin wanted to learn and grow, but within the security of his family and community. Any educational plan that ignored those priorities would ultimately fail to serve his real interests. Attorney Barnes made notes on his legal pad. As he processed Kevin's preferences, "That actually simplifies our approach significantly. We can establish legal boundaries around media access while creating educational partnerships that don't require Kevin to leave Brookton back at the Anderson estate." Dr. Wallace was presenting a similar conclusion to Diane and Brett, though from a different perspective. "Mrs. Anderson, I think Anderson Manufacturing has an opportunity to demonstrate real corporate leadership by supporting Kevin's education. In partnership with West Virginia University," Dr. Wallace explained. "Instead of being seen as the company that tried to retaliate against a gifted child, you could become the business that recognized and nurtured local talent." Diane's business instincts immediately grasped the public relations value of such an approach, but her maternal instincts were focused on the deeper issue of her son's character development Dr. Wallace, that sounds like an excellent proposal, but it would require Brett to publicly acknowledge that his actions toward Kevin were inappropriate, she said, looking directly at her son. I'm not sure he's ready to take that kind of responsibility. Brett squirmed under his mother's gaze, realizing that his options were narrowing to either genuine accountability or continued escalation of a conflict he couldn't win. The week's events had demonstrated that community support was entirely on Kevin's side, and continuing to fight would only make Brett look worse. What exactly would I have to do? Brett asked reluctantly. You would need to publicly apologize to Kevin and his family for attempting to humiliate him, Dr. Wallace replied without hesitation. You would also need to acknowledge his genuine technical abilities and support the educational partnership we're proposing. The requirements were straightforward, but demanding, asking Brett to surrender the privileged arrogance that had defined his identity in favor of basic human decency for someone who had never been required to admit mistakes or show respect for people he considered beneath him. The prospect was genuinely challenging. And if I don't? Brett asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Then Anderson Manufacturing will continue to be portrayed as a company that harasses gifted children and their families, Diane replied bluntly. The public relations damage will continue to escalate, and our business relationships throughout the region will suffer accordingly. The business consequences were serious enough, but Diane's expression suggested that the family consequences would be even more severe. Brett was beginning to understand that his mother's patience with his behavior had reached its limits at Taylor Auto Repair. The evening meeting was reaching similar conclusions through a different route. The adults had agreed on a framework that would provide Kevin with advanced educational opportunities while maintaining his connection to family and community. But they also recognized the need for the Anderson family to take responsibility for their role in creating the current crisis. We need some kind of public acknowledgement that this whole situation started because Brett Anderson tried to humiliate Kevin, Frank Sullivan said firmly. The boy deserves an apology, and the community deserves to know that corporate retaliation isn't acceptable. Dave nodded agreement, though his expression suggested mixed feelings about the requirement. Frank's right. But I don't want Kevin to become more of a public figure than he already is. An apology should be private between families. I disagree, Gladys Turner interjected gently. Brett's attempts to humiliate Kevin were public, and the retaliation against local businesses was public. The apology needs to be public too, or people will think that wealthy families can mistreat others without consequences. Kevin looked up from his carburetor with a question that demonstrated his growing awareness of the adult conflict surrounding him. Why does Brett Anderson want to hurt our family? We never did anything to him. The innocent question highlighted exactly why the situation required resolution. An 8-year-old boy was being forced to contemplate adult cruelty and injustice because of circumstances beyond his control, and that reality was unacceptable to everyone present who had Kevin's interests at heart. Kevin, Dave said carefully. Sometimes people get angry when they feel embarrassed, and they blame other people instead of learning from their mistakes. But that's their problem, not yours. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward with the practical focus that had made her an effective educator. Kevin, the important thing is that we're going to make sure you can keep learning about engineering while staying here with your family. The rest of this adult drama doesn't really affect you. As both meetings moved toward their conclusions, it became clear that the resolution of Kevin's situation would require Brett Anderson to choose between his privileged pride and his family's future. The decision would determine not only his own character development, but also whether the broader community conflict could be transformed into something positive for everyone involved. Kevin himself remained focused on the carburetor he was reassembling, apparently more interested in understanding how the mechanical components worked together than in the complex social dynamics that his technical competence had triggered. His innocence and genuine curiosity stood in stark contrast to the adult conflict, swirling around him, serving as a reminder of what really mattered in the midst of all the political and social complications. The evening ended with both groups recognizing that the next day would bring either resolution or further escalation, depending on choices that would test everyone's character and priorities. Saturday morning dawned with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made the mountains around Brookton look like they had been painted against the sky. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves along with an undercurrent of anticipation that seemed to permeate the entire community. Word had spread through the informal networks that connected everyone in the small town. Something significant was going to happen today at the Anderson manufacturing plant. Workers arriving for the weekend maintenance shift found an unusual sight in the main parking lot. A small platform had been erected near the employee entrance, complete with a microphone system, and folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Corporate events were rare enough at the factory, but outdoor gatherings were virtually unprecedented, suggesting that management had something important to communicate. Frank Sullivan arrived early for his shift and found himself studying the setup with the analytical attention he brought to equipment problems. "What do you think this is about?" asked Tony Marcelli, joining him near the platform. "Could be about the Kevin Taylor situation," Frank replied. "Thoughtfully, been a lot of pressure on the Anderson family to address what happened. About time," Tony said with satisfaction. "Boy deserves better treatment than he's gotten from Brett and his friends." By mid-morning, the parking lot had filled with employees, family members, and what appeared to be half the population of Brookton. News of the gathering had spread beyond the factory workforce to include customers from local businesses, parents from the elementary school, and curious residents who had been following Kevin's story in the newspaper. Dave Taylor stood near the back of the crowd with Kevin beside him, both looking uncomfortable with the attention their presence attracted. Kevin wore his best clothes, a button-down shirt and clean jeans that Linda had insisted on after learning about the public gathering. The boy seemed more interested in the mechanical aspects of the sound system than in the crowd of adults discussing his situation. "Dad, why did they want us to come to this?" Kevin asked, his voice barely audible over the murmur of conversation surrounding them. "I'm not entirely sure," son Dave replied honestly, "but Mrs. Anderson said it was important for our family to be here." Gladys Turner appeared beside them, with the purposeful stride of someone navigating through crowds with decades of experience. "Dave, Kevin," she said warmly, "I wanted you to know that whatever happens here today, the community stands behind your family." The sentiment was echoed by the positioning of the crowd itself. Factory workers, small business owners, and longtime residents had naturally arranged themselves in a show of support around the Taylor family, creating a buffer zone of friendly faces that provided both protection and encouragement. At precisely 10, Diane Anderson emerged from the factory building and walked toward the platform with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to public speaking. She wore a business suit that managed to look both professional and approachable, the carefully chosen attire of someone who understood the importance of visual communication. Behind her came Brett Anderson, moving with the reluctant steps of someone being led to an execution. His usual arrogant confidence had been replaced by obvious discomfort, and his eyes avoided making contact with anyone in the crowd. The contrast between mother and son was stark, highlighting the difference between mature accountability and adolescent resistance. "Thank you all for coming," Diane began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone system. "I've asked you here today because our company and our family owe this community an apology, and some debts can only be paid in public." The directness of her opening statement sent a ripple of surprise through the crowd. Most people had expected corporate double talk and careful evasions, not the kind of straightforward acknowledgement that Diane was providing. 10 days ago, my son Brett brought 8-year-old Kevin Taylor to our factory with the intention of embarrassing him in front of our employees. Diane continued, her voice steady. Despite the obvious difficulty of the admission, Brett expected Kevin to fail when challenged to diagnose a complex machinery problem, and he brought cameras to record that failure for his own entertainment. Brett's face wrined as his mother detailed his cruel intentions in front of the entire community. But he remained silent beside the platform, apparently, under strict instructions not to interrupt the proceedings. What Brett didn't expect was that Kevin Taylor would succeed brilliantly, demonstrating technical knowledge and problem-solving abilities that impressed our most experienced engineers. Diane went on. Instead of celebrating Kevin's success and learning from his own mistakes, Brett responded with anger and retaliation. Frank Sullivan nodded approvingly from his position near the front of the crowd, while several other factory workers exchanged glances that suggested their respect for Diane Anderson was increasing with every word. In the days that followed, members of our management team attempted to pressure local businesses with false safety violations and bureaucratic harassment. Diane admitted, her voice carrying genuine regret. These actions were meant to punish Kevin's family and their supporters for making us look incompetent. The public acknowledgement of corporate retaliation drew murmurs of anger from the crowd, but also expressions of satisfaction that the truth was finally being told openly. Mrs. Henderson, standing near the middle of the gathering, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as she heard her ordeal officially recognized. These actions were wrong. They were cruel, and they have no place in a community that depends on mutual respect and cooperation. Diane said firmly. Anderson Manufacturing was built on the principle that good ideas can come from anyone, regardless of their age or background. My son's behavior violated those principles, and so did our company's response. Kevin looked up at his father with a puzzled expression, apparently struggling to understand why adults would respond to his technical help with such complicated emotions. Dave squeezed his son's shoulder gently, recognizing that the boy's innocence was both a blessing and a vulnerability in situations like this. I want to publicly apologize to Kevin Taylor and his family for the treatment they received from my son and from Anderson Manufacturing. Diane continued, her eyes finding Dave and Kevin in the crowd. Kevin demonstrated exactly the kind of curiosity, competence, and problem-solving ability that should be celebrated and nurtured, not mocked or punished. The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, with factory workers leading the response, but the entire crowd joining in. Kevin seemed startled by the attention, while Dave felt a mixture of relief and vindication that his son's abilities were finally receiving appropriate recognition. But acknowledgement isn't enough. Diane went once the applause subsided. Anderson Manufacturing wants to do more than apologize. We want to demonstrate our commitment to supporting local talent and educational opportunity. She gestured toward Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who stepped forward with a folder of documents that had clearly been prepared in advance. Dr. Mitchell from West Virginia University has worked with our family to create an educational partnership that will provide Kevin with advanced learning opportunities while allowing him to remain with his family and continue his regular schooling. Dr. Mitchell approached the microphone with the composed manner of someone accustomed to academic presentations. Anderson Manufacturing will fund a comprehensive engineering education program for Kevin that includes summer workshops, mentorship from university faculty, and access to laboratory facilities during school breaks. She announced the program is designed to nurture his abilities without disrupting his childhood or family relationships. The crowd's response was enthusiastic, with particular approval from factory workers who understood the value of combining practical experience with formal education. Frank Sullivan led another round of applause, clearly pleased that Kevin's abilities were being taken seriously by credible institutions. Additionally, Dr. Mitchell continued, Anderson Manufacturing will establish a scholarship fund for other local students who demonstrate exceptional aptitude in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This community has shown that talent can emerge anywhere, and we want to ensure that economic circumstances never prevent that talent from being developed. The announcement of broader educational opportunities drew the strongest response yet from the crowd, with parents and grandparents expressing particular appreciation for programs that could benefit their own children and grandchildren. Diane returned to the microphone as Dr. Mitchell stepped back. These programs represent our long-term commitment to this community, but they don't address the immediate need for my son to take personal responsibility for his actions. She turned to look at Brett, who had been standing silently throughout the proceedings, with an expression of barely controlled misery. Brett has something he needs to say to Kevin, and to all of you. Brett approached the microphone, with obvious reluctance, his usual arrogance completely absent when he spoke. His voice was barely audible, requiring him to lean closer to the microphone and try again. I want to apologize to Kevin Taylor and his family. Brett began his words, halting and clearly difficult. I brought Kevin to the factory because I thought it would be funny to watch him fail in front of adults. I wanted to embarrass him because I felt threatened by the idea that someone from his background might be smarter than me. The admission was painful to watch, partly because of Brett's obvious discomfort, but mostly because it revealed the ugly assumptions that had motivated his behavior. The crowd listened in silence, recognizing that genuine accountability required this kind of uncomfortable honesty. When Kevin succeeded instead of failing, I got angry and tried to find ways to punish him and his family. Brett continued, his voice growing stronger as he worked through the confession. I convinced company employees to harass local businesses with fake safety violations, and I came to Kevin's school to try to force him to deny his own abilities. Kevin looked up at his father with a question in his eyes, apparently beginning to understand for the first time the full extent of the adult conflicts that had surrounded his simple act of mechanical problem-solving. Kevin Taylor is smarter than me, and he's a better person than me, Brett said, looking directly at the 8-year-old for the first time since the proceedings began. He helped solve a problem when asked, and I tried to punish him for being competent. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. The apology was clearly genuine, spoken with the kind of difficulty that suggested real internal struggle, rather than empty words chosen for public relations purposes. Brett's obvious discomfort actually made his statement more credible, because everyone could see that humbling himself in front of the entire community was genuinely painful for someone accustomed to privilege and deference. I also want to apologize to Mrs. Henderson and the other business owners who were harassed because of my actions. Brett continued, his voice steadying as he worked through the list of people he had wronged. You didn't deserve to be pressured with fake violations, just because I couldn't handle being shown up by an 8-year-old. Mrs. Henderson nodded acceptance. From her position in the crowd, her expression suggesting forgiveness, tempered by the expectation that Brett's future behavior would need to match his current words. Dave Taylor felt Kevin tugging at his sleeve and leaned down to hear his son's whispered question. Dad, what should I say to him? The question revealed Kevin's fundamental decency, even in the face of Brett's confession about cruel intentions, despite learning that Brett had deliberately tried to humiliate him. Kevin's first instinct was to consider what response would be appropriate and helpful. Whatever feels right to you, son, Dave whispered back. But remember that accepting an apology doesn't mean you have to pretend everything is fine. Kevin nodded thoughtfully and stepped forward from the crowd, approaching the platform with the same direct manner he brought to technical problems. The entire gathering watched in silence as the 8-year-old boy walked toward the teenager who had tried to destroy his family's reputation. Brett, Kevin said, his young voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. I accept your apology, but I want you to understand something. Brett looked down at Kevin with an expression that mixed shame with genuine curiosity about what the boy might say. I didn't fix your machine to make anyone look bad. Kevin continued with the simple honesty that characterized all his communications. I fixed it because machines are supposed to work, and when they don't work, someone should fix them. That's what my dad taught me. The statement contained a wisdom that went far beyond Kevin's 8 years, highlighting the difference between approaching problems with genuine helpfulness versus using them as opportunities for competition or dominance. I hope you can learn to help people instead of trying to hurt them, Kevin concluded, extending his small hand toward Brett in an offer of reconciliation that demonstrated more maturity than many adults possessed. Brett stared at the offered handshake for a moment, clearly recognizing the generosity of Kevin's response. When he finally accepted the handshake, his grip was gentle and respectful, acknowledging both Kevin's forgiveness and his own need for continued growth. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming, with applause that seemed to go on forever, as the community witnessed an 8-year-old boy demonstrate the kind of grace under pressure that adults often struggled to achieve. Kevin's handling of the situation had transformed what could have been a moment of triumph over a defeated enemy into something approaching genuine reconciliation. As the formal proceedings concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Dave Taylor realized that his son had not only demonstrated exceptional technical abilities, but had also shown remarkable emotional intelligence in navigating complex social situations. Kevin's combination of intellectual gifts and fundamental decency suggested that the educational opportunities being offered would be built on a foundation of character that could support whatever achievements the future might bring. 3 months later, the first Saturday in January brought a different kind of gathering to Brookton. Snow covered the mountains in pristine white, and the Anderson manufacturing parking lot had been transformed into a celebration space with warming stations, hot chocolate vendors, and display tables showcasing student projects from the newly established STEM education program. Kevin Taylor stood beside a table displaying his latest project, a detailed model of an improved automotive transmission system that he had designed during his winter break workshop at West Virginia University. The model was constructed from salvage parts and machined components, demonstrating both theoretical understanding and practical craftsmanship that impressed the engineering professors who had supervised his work. "Kevin, can you explain how your design improves efficiency?" asked Dr. William Carter, who had traveled from MIT specifically to observe the progress of Brookton's educational experiment. The distinguished professor leaned forward with genuine interest, treating the 8-year-old's work with the same seriousness he brought to graduate student research. "The traditional design loses energy through friction at multiple contact points," Kevin explained, pointing to specific components in his model. "By redistributing the gear ratios and using ceramic bearings here and here, we can reduce energy loss by approximately 12% while improving durability." Dr. Carter nodded approvingly, making notes in the small notebook he carried everywhere. "Have you tested these calculations? We built a smaller prototype at the university lab and ran it for 40 hours. Kevin replied with the methodical precision that characterized all his technical discussions. The efficiency improvements held up under load testing, and the wear patterns were significantly better than conventional designs. The conversation attracted a crowd of parents, students, and community members who had come to see the results of Anderson Manufacturing's educational investment. Among them stood Brett Anderson, now dressed in work clothes rather than expensive casual wear, his hands showing the calluses that came from spending his weekends in Frank Sullivan's factory maintenance training program. "Kevin," Brett said, approaching the display table with the respectful manner he had adopted since his public apology, "that's really impressive work. Mind if I take a closer look?" Kevin nodded agreeably, apparently holding no grudges about their difficult history. "Sure, the ceramic bearings are the really interesting part. They cost more initially, but they last 3 times longer than steel bearings and generate less heat." Brett studied the model with obvious interest, asking technical questions that demonstrated he had been learning engineering principles rather than simply serving time in his community service assignment. The interaction between the two boys drew attention from adults who remembered the animosity that had brought them together originally. "Brett's been working really hard in the factory training program," Frank Sullivan commented to Dave Taylor as they watched the boys discuss transmission design. "Kid's got decent instincts once he stops thinking he knows everything already." Dave nodded, pleased to see that Brett's apology had been followed by genuine efforts at personal improvement. "Kevin mentions him sometimes, says Brett asks good questions during their workshop sessions." The educational partnership that had emerged from the crisis had evolved into something more comprehensive than anyone had originally envisioned. Kevin's advanced program had attracted other gifted students from throughout the region, creating a collaborative learning environment where children work together on increasingly sophisticated projects under university supervision. "Dad, look at this," called Emma Taylor, Kevin's 6-year-old sister, who was examining a robotics project created by 2 5th graders from a neighboring county. The robot was designed to assist elderly people with household tasks, combining sensors, mobility systems, and user interface design that demonstrated impressive integration of multiple engineering disciplines. Linda Taylor joined her daughter at the robotics display, marveling at the sophistication of work being produced by elementary school students. "Emma, maybe you'll want to join Kevin's program when you're older. I want to design better wheelchairs," Emma announced with the certainty that only children possessed. "Mrs. Peterson next door has trouble getting around, and I think her wheelchair could work better." The comment drew a smile from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had been observing the family interaction. "Emma, that's exactly the kind of problem-solving thinking we want to encourage. Engineering should always be about helping people." As the afternoon progressed, the celebration became less about showcasing individual achievements and more about demonstrating the transformation that had occurred throughout Brookton. Local businesses had partnered with the educational program to provide internships and mentorship opportunities, while the factory had opened its training facilities to students interested in hands-on learning experiences. "This is beyond what I imagined." When we started, Diane Anderson confided to Gladys Turner as they watched students explaining their projects to fascinated adults. "Kevin's crisis forced us to think more seriously about our responsibility to this community." Gladys smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had predicted positive outcomes from difficult circumstances. "Diane, sometimes the best things grow out of the worst situations. Your family's willingness to take responsibility and make amends turned a tragedy into an opportunity." The comment highlighted the remarkable transformation that had occurred, not just in Kevin's life, but throughout the community. What had begun as one teenager's attempt to humiliate a younger child had evolved into a comprehensive educational initiative that was attracting attention from universities and corporations throughout the region. Mrs. Anderson, Kevin said, approaching with his characteristic directness, "I wanted to thank you for making this program possible. I've learned more in 3 months than I thought I could learn in 3 years." Diane looked down at the earnest 8-year-old who had inadvertently saved her family from their own worst impulses. "Kevin, I think we've all learned more than we expected. You taught us that talent and character can come from anywhere, and that recognizing it makes everyone stronger." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Rebecca Stone from the Brookton Herald, now accompanied by reporters from Charleston and Pittsburgh who were documenting the success of the rural STEM education experiment. The media attention was different, this time focused on celebrating achievements rather than exploiting conflicts. "Kevin, how has the advanced program changed your goals for the future?" Rebecca asked, holding her recorder with the professional competence that had made her the region's most respected education journalist. "I still want to help my dad at the garage," Kevin replied without hesitation. "But now, I also want to design better engines and maybe teach other kids about engineering. There are lots of problems that need solving, and the more people who understand how things work, the better solutions we can find." The answer reflected both Kevin's fundamental loyalty to his family and his growing awareness of broader possibilities for contributing to society. His engineering education had enhanced rather than replaced his connection to practical hands-on problem-solving. Dr. Carter stepped forward with an announcement that drew attention from everyone present. "I'm pleased to report that MIT has approved a partnership with the Brookton STEM program that will provide summer research opportunities for qualified students. Kevin will be our first participant working on automotive efficiency projects that build on the transmission design he's showcased today." The news generated enthusiastic applause, but Kevin's response demonstrated the maturity that had characterized his handling of every aspect of his unexpected fame. "Dr. Carter, I'm honored by the opportunity," Kevin said formally, "but I want to make sure I can still spend time helping my dad and working with the other kids in our local program. Those relationships are really important to me." The MIT professor smiled, recognizing that Kevin's priorities reflected exactly the kind of grounded wisdom that would make him successful, regardless of whatever achievements the future might bring. "Kevin, the program is designed around your preferences," Dr. Carter assured him. "We want to enhance what you're already doing, not replace it." As the celebration continued into the early evening, Dave Taylor found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought his family to this point. Kevin's simple act of mechanical problem-solving had triggered a crisis that could have destroyed their lives, but the community's response had transformed potential tragedy into unprecedented opportunity. "Dad," Kevin said, joining his father near the edge of the crowd, "do you think things worked out the way they were supposed to?" Dave considered the question with the careful attention it deserved. "Kevin, I think things worked out the way they did because good people made good choices when it mattered. You helped solve a problem." When asked, Mrs. Turner and Frank Sullivan stood up for what was right, and even Brett Anderson learned to take responsibility for his mistakes, and Mrs. Anderson made sure everyone had chances to learn and grow. Kevin added, demonstrating his awareness of the broader community dynamics that had shaped recent events. "That's right," Dave agreed. "Sometimes the most important thing about a crisis isn't what caused it, but how people choose to respond." Kevin nodded thoughtfully, processing this wisdom. With the same systematic approach he brought to engineering and problems, "Dad, I'm glad I got to help fix their machine, even with all the complicated stuff that happened afterward. Helping people solve problems feels like the right thing to do." The simple statement captured everything that mattered about Kevin's character and the values that would guide his future achievements. His technical abilities were exceptional, but his fundamental decency and desire to help others would ultimately determine how those abilities served the world. As families began loading their cars and heading home through the snowy evening, the parking lot at Anderson Manufacturing looked like the site of a community celebration rather than a corporate facility. Children carried project models and certificates of achievement, while parents exchanged contact information and made plans for continued collaboration. Brett Anderson helped clean up the display tables with the efficient competence he had learned during his factory training, working alongside Kevin and the other program participants with none of the arrogance that had characterized his earlier behavior. The transformation in his character had been as remarkable as Kevin's academic achievements, demonstrating the personal growth was possible at any age when supported by appropriate accountability and opportunity. Kevin said as they folded the last table, "Thanks for helping with the cleanup, and thanks for working so hard in the training. Program Frank says you're becoming a really good troubleshooter." Brett smiled with genuine pleasure at the recognition, understanding that earning Kevin's respect required demonstrating competence and character rather than simply claiming superior status. "Kevin working with actual equipment has taught me more about engineering than I learned in all my previous classes." Combined, Brett replied, "Honestly, I think I understand now why your approach to problems is so effective." The conversation between the two boys symbolized the broader transformation that had occurred throughout Brookton. What had begun as a conflict based on prejudice and privilege had evolved into collaboration based on mutual respect and shared commitment to learning. As the Taylor family drove home through the quiet streets of their small mountain town, Kevin pressed his face to the car window to watch the lights in houses where families were settling in for the evening. The sight reminded him of all the people who had supported his family during their difficult period and who continued to be part of the educational community that was growing around them. "Dad," Kevin said, as they pulled into the familiar driveway. "Beside Taylor Auto Repair, I know I'm getting lots of opportunities to learn about engineering, but I never want to forget that the most important thing is helping people solve problems." Dave turned off the engine and looked at his son with the pride that came from recognizing character, as well as ability. "Kevin, as long as you remember that, I think you'll do just fine with whatever opportunities come your way." The story of Kevin Taylor's extraordinary abilities had begun with a cruel joke intended to highlight his limitations. It ended with a transformed community that understood the value of nurturing talent regardless of its source, and an 8-year-old boy whose technical genius was matched by the wisdom to use it in service of others in the years that would follow. Kevin's achievements would indeed be remarkable, but the foundation for those achievements had been laid not in university laboratories or corporate programs, but in a small-town garage where a father taught his son that the purpose of understanding how things work was always ultimately to help them work better for everyone. The end up next too. More incredible stories are waiting for you, right? On your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a